At 10:26 hours on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey stood in the cockpit of his SBD Dauntless dive bomber at 14,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, watching three Japanese aircraft carriers turn into the wind 25 miles below. McCluskey commanded Bombing Squadron 6 and Scouting Squadron 6 from the carrier USS Enterprise. For the past hour, he had been searching for the Japanese fleet with fuel running critically low. His squadrons had launched at 0700 hours, expecting to find the enemy carriers 155 miles southwest of Midway Island. They had found empty ocean. McCluskey had made a command decision that violated doctrine and risked court-martial. Instead of returning to Enterprise when he failed to find targets at the expected location, he continued searching. He flew northwest on intuition and fuel vapors. At 1005 hours, a lookout spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northeast. McCluskey followed that wake. At 10:22 hours, he found what he was looking for. Three Japanese carriers, their decks crowded with aircraft being armed and fueled for a strike against the American fleet. The carriers were Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, three of the four fleet carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. They were the core of the Kido Butai, the Japanese carrier strike force that had dominated the Pacific since December 7, 1941. They had sunk the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, destroyed Darwin, Australia, raided the Indian Ocean, and crushed every naval force that opposed them. Now they were vulnerable. Their decks were cluttered with aircraft fuel lines and ordnance. Their fighters were at low altitude, having just engaged American torpedo bombers. Their crews were focused on preparing the next strike. They were not looking up. McCluskey pushed over into his dive at 10:26 hours. 37 Dauntless dive bombers followed him down. In 4 minutes, 2 of the 3 carriers would be burning. In 1 day, the Kido Butai would cease to exist. And Akagi, the flagship that had led Japan's carrier revolution, would be on the bottom of the Pacific, with 267 of her crew. Akagi was never supposed to be an aircraft carrier. She was laid down on December 6, 1920 at Kure Naval Arsenal as hull number 259, one of 4 Amagi-class battlecruisers ordered under the 8-8 Fleet program. The 8-8 Fleet was Japan's interwar naval expansion plan, calling for 8 battleships and 8 battlecruisers, all less than 8 years old, creating the most powerful battle line in the Pacific. The Amagi-class battlecruisers were designed to counter American Lexington-class battlecruisers then under construction. Akagi would displace 41 200 tons fully loaded measure, 26 feet long, and mount 10 16-inch guns in 5 twin turrets. Her design speed was 30 knots, powered by 19 Campon boilers, feeding 4 steam turbines generating 131,000 shaft horsepower. Her belt armor would be 10 inches thick, amidships her deck armor 3.7 inches over the magazines. She would be fast enough to catch cruisers, powerful enough to destroy anything she could catch, and armored enough to survive combat with other battlecruisers. Construction proceeded through 1921. By December, her hull was 60% complete. Her machinery, 40% installed, her armor, 20% fitted. Then, the Washington Naval Treaty destroyed her future. The treaty, signed February 6, 1922, limited battleship and battlecruiser tonnage for the 5 major naval powers. Britain and the United States were each allowed 525,000 tons of capital ships. Japan was allowed 315,000 tons. France and Italy were each allowed 175,000 tons. The treaty defined capital ships as any vessel displacing over 10,000 tons with guns larger than 8 inches. All battleship and battlecruiser construction had to stop immediately. Existing vessels exceeding treaty limits had to be scrapped. Japan was forced to cancel or scrap 16 capital ships under construction or recently completed. The Amagi-class battlecruisers were on the list. All 4 hulls were to be scrapped. But the treaty included a provision allowing each nation to convert up to 2 capital ship hulls under construction into aircraft carriers, provided the total carrier tonnage did not exceed 81,000 tons for Britain and the United States or 27,000 tons for Japan. This provision was intended to allow navies to experiment with carrier aviation without wasting partially completed hulls. Japan chose to convert Amagi and Akagi into carriers. The conversion would transform 2 battlecruisers into the largest carriers in the world. The decision was controversial within the Imperial Japanese Navy. In 1922, carrier aviation was unproven. Aircraft were fragile, short-ranged, and lightly armed. Most admirals believed the battleships would decide naval wars just as they had in World War I. Converting two battlecruiser hulls into experimental aviation ships seemed wasteful, but a small faction of younger officers argued that carrier aviation represented the future. Commander Isoroku Yamamoto, who would later plan the Pearl Harbor attack, was among the most vocal proponents. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921 and observed American carrier experiments. He believed aircraft would replace battleship guns as the primary naval weapon. The conversion plan for Akagi was approved in November 1923. Engineers at Kure Naval Arsenal faced extraordinary technical challenges. They had to convert a hull designed for heavy guns and armor into a platform for launching and recovering aircraft. No one in Japan had done this before. The only reference was British and American carriers, all smaller and less complex than what Akagi would become. The first decision was how to arrange the flight deck. American carriers like USS Langley and USS Lexington used a single flight deck above the main hull. The flight deck was supported by a steel framework and was not structurally part of the ship. This design was simple, but limited aircraft capacity because only the top deck could operate aircraft. British carriers used a similar design. Japanese engineers considered a different approach. The carrier HMS Furious, converted from a battlecruiser in 1917 to 1918, had experimented with a two-deck system, a landing deck aft and a takeoff deck forward. The arrangement was abandoned because it proved unworkable. Aircraft taking off forward and landing aft could not safely pass each other. But Japanese engineers believed a three-deck system might work. One full-length upper flight deck for landing, one shorter middle flight deck for smaller aircraft, one lower flight deck for takeoffs. Aircraft would land on the upper deck, be lowered by elevator to the middle or lower decks, then launch from the forward end of those decks. The system would triple the carrier's operating capacity. Multiple aircraft could take off simultaneously from different decks while other aircraft landed above them. It was innovative, complex, and had never been attempted. Construction began in December 1923. Workers stripped everything from Akagi's hull above the waterline. The 5 turrets not yet installed were canceled. The superstructure was removed. The armor partially fitted was reconfigured. The result was a hull with 3 distinct flight deck levels. The upper flight deck was 624 feet long and 95 feet wide, running from amidships to the stern. It was used exclusively for landing. Aircraft approaching from astern would catch arresting wires stretched across the deck. Once stopped, the aircraft would be struck below by elevator to the hangar decks. The middle flight deck was 190 feet long and 52 feet wide, located forward on the starboard side. It was used for launching small aircraft like fighters. The lower flight deck was 160 feet long and 52 feet wide, located forward on the port side below the middle deck. It was used for launching larger aircraft like torpedo bombers. This 3-deck arrangement was unique to Japanese carriers. No other navy attempted it. The reasoning was that Japan needed maximum aircraft capacity from limited carrier tonnage. The Washington Treaty restricted Japan to 27,000 tons of carriers. Britain and America had 81,000 tons. To achieve parity in air power, Japanese carriers had to operate more aircraft per ton of displacement. The 3-deck system was supposed to provide that advantage. In practice, the system was deeply flawed. The multiple decks created confusion. Aircraft launching from the forward decks were exposed to wind and spray. The decks were narrow, limiting the size of aircraft that could operate from them. Most critically, the 3-deck system made no sense operationally. While fighters launched from the middle deck and bombers launched from the lower deck, no aircraft could land. The landing deck was blocked by aircraft taking off below it. This negated the entire purpose of having multiple decks. Japanese naval aviators recognized these problems during Akagi's trials in 1927 to 1928. They recommended eliminating the forward decks and extending the landing deck forward to create a single full-length flight deck. The modifications were expensive. The Imperial Japanese Navy had already spent 21 million yen converting Akagi, approximately $10 million, an enormous sum for a navy operating on a limited budget. Extending the flight deck would cost millions more. The modifications were deferred. Akagi was commissioned on March 25, 1927, with her three-deck configuration intact. She displaced 36 500 tons fully loaded. Her air group consisted of 60 aircraft, a mix of fighters, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers. Her top speed was 31.2 knots. Her range was 8,200 nautical miles at 14 knots. She was the largest carrier in the world and the flagship of Japan's carrier fleet. The three-deck system was used operationally for 2 years. Pilots hated it. The forward decks were dangerous in rough seas. Coordinating launches from 3 separate decks while recovering aircraft on the upper deck was chaotic. Accident rates were higher than on conventional carriers. By 1929, the Navy acknowledged the design was a failure. In 1935, Akagi returned to Sasebo Naval Arsenal for reconstruction. The work took 3 years and cost 23 million yen, more than the original conversion. The middle and lower flight decks were removed. The landing deck was extended forward to create a single full-length flight deck 845 feet long. The flight deck was widened to 102 feet. 2 elevators were installed to move aircraft between the flight deck and the hangar deck. The island superstructure, originally located on the port side amidships, was eliminated entirely. Akagi would operate without an island, with command and control spaces located below the flight deck. This was another unique Japanese design choice. American and British carriers had prominent island superstructures on the starboard side, containing the bridge, flight control, and navigation spaces. Islands provided excellent visibility, but reduced deck space and created turbulence that complicated landing approaches. Japanese designers believed eliminating the island would maximize deck space and improve airflow across the deck. Command would be exercised from below using periscopes and voice tubes. In practice, this created severe problems. Commanders had limited visibility. Communication was difficult. During combat, officers below decks had no direct view of the tactical situation. The disadvantages outweighed the minor benefits. But in 1938, when Akagi emerged from reconstruction, she was the most modern carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Her reconstructed air group could operate 66 aircraft, including 18 Mitsubishi A-5M fighters, 18 Aichi D-1A dive bombers, and 30 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers. Her flight deck was longer than any American carrier. Her aircraft capacity was greater than USS Enterprise or USS Yorktown. She was fast, modern, and ready for war. The doctrine Akagi was designed to execute was revolutionary. In the 1930s, most navies viewed carriers as scouts and support vessels for the battle line. Carriers would search for enemy fleets, spot for battleship gunfire, and protect the main force from air attack. Decisive combat would be decided by battleship guns. Japanese planners, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, rejected this doctrine. They believed carriers were the main force. Massed carrier airstrikes could destroy enemy carriers, cripple battleships, and control sea space without surface ships ever engaging. This doctrine required concentrating carriers into a single powerful force. The Kido Butai, or Carrier Strike Force, was formed in April 1941. It consisted initially of all 6 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kagasoryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, operating as a unified command under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. The concentration of carriers was unprecedented. American carriers operated independently or in pairs. British carriers were dispersed across multiple theaters. Only Japan massed its carriers into a single overwhelming force. The tactical advantage was clear. The Kido Butai could launch 350 aircraft in a single strike, more than the entire air group of any enemy fleet. The massed air attack would saturate defenses and destroy targets before they could respond. The Kido Butai would control the sea, and destroy enemy forces at ranges where surface ships were irrelevant. The doctrine was proven at Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Akagi and 5 other carriers launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves. The attack sank or damaged 8 battleships, destroyed 188 aircraft, killed 243 Americans, and crippled the Pacific Fleet for 6 months. The Kido Butai achieved complete surprise and tactical perfection. Akagi's air group alone accounted for 1 battleship, sunk 2 battleships damaged, and dozens of aircraft destroyed. Her pilots returned to the carrier, reporting total success. Admiral Nagumo chose not to launch a 3rd wave. The decision was controversial then and remains debated. A third wave might have destroyed fuel storage tanks and repair facilities, crippling Pearl Harbor for years. But Nagumo feared American carriers were nearby and might counterattack while his carriers were recovering aircraft. The decision to withdraw was cautious, conservative, and ultimately correct. The Kido Butai escaped without loss. Through December 1941 and into early 1942, the Kido Butai rampaged across the Pacific. Akagi participated in strikes against Wake Island, Darwin, and Ceylon. Her aircraft sank the British heavy cruisers HMS Cornwall and HMS Dorsetshire on April 5, 1942. The cruisers were caught in open ocean without air cover. Akagi's dive bombers and torpedo bombers attacked simultaneously from multiple directions. Both cruisers sank within 20 minutes. It was textbook carrier doctrine. Massed airstrikes, coordinated attacks, overwhelming force, complete victory. But the doctrine had weaknesses. Concentrating 6 carriers in a single force created a single point of failure. If the Kido Butai was caught by surprise, if its fighters were out of position, if its decks were cluttered with aircraft during rearming, the entire force was vulnerable. American planners understood this. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor, knew he could not match the Kido Butai in strength. His carriers were fewer, his aircraft were fewer, his pilots were less experienced. But if he could catch the Japanese carriers vulnerable, if he could strike at the decisive moment, numbers might not matter. The opportunity came at Midway. Japanese plans for June 1942 called for capturing Midway Island, a strategic position 100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. Possession of Midway would extend Japan's defensive perimeter and potentially draw out the American fleet for a decisive battle. Admiral Yamamoto, now commander of the combined fleet, planned a complex operation involving multiple task forces approaching Midway from different directions. The Kido Butai, now reduced to 4 carriers after Shokaku and Zuikaku were damaged at Coral Sea, would strike Midway on June 4, suppressing its defenses so invasion forces could land. American codebreakers had decrypted Japanese communications and knew the attack was coming. Nimitz positioned his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway to ambush the Kido Butai after it struck the island. The American plan required precise timing. The Japanese carriers would launch their strike against Midway at dawn. While those aircraft were away, the carriers would be vulnerable. American dive bombers would strike during that window. Everything depended on finding the Japanese carriers at the right moment. On June 4, 1942, the Kido Butai approached Midway from the northwest. Akagi, Kagasoryu, and Hiryu were arrayed in a box formation, each carrier spaced several miles from the others. The formation provided mutual anti-aircraft support while allowing independent maneuvers. At 430 hours, Admiral Nagumo launched the first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft, 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers, and 36 torpedo bombers departed the 4 carriers and headed southeast. Nagumo retained 93 aircraft aboard the carriers as a reserve strike force. These aircraft were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against American ships if they appeared. Nagumo did not know where the American carriers were or if they were even in the area. Japanese reconnaissance had been inadequate. Search aircraft had launched late, covered incomplete sectors, and missed the American carriers entirely. At 700 hours, the strike force reached Midway and attacked. American fighters and anti-aircraft fire were heavier than expected. The Japanese lost several aircraft and failed to suppress the airfield completely. At 700 hours, the strike leader radioed Nagumo, requesting a second strike. Midway's defenses were still operational. More attacks were needed. Simultaneously, American aircraft from Midway obsolete bombers and torpedo planes began attacking the Kido Butai. The attacks were uncoordinated and ineffective. Japanese fighters shot down most of the attackers. None hit the carriers. But the attacks convinced Nagumo that Midway required a second strike. At 07:15 hours, he ordered the reserve aircraft rearmed. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs were removed and replaced with high-explosive bombs for use against land targets. Rearming 93 aircraft was a complex process. Ordnance crews had to move each aircraft to the hangar deck, remove the anti-ship weapons, bring up land attack weapons from the magazines, install them on the aircraft, then move the aircraft back to the flight deck. The process took approximately 90 minutes under ideal conditions. At 07:28 hours, while rearming was underway, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft reported sighting American ships 240 miles northeast. The report was vague. The pilot identified 10 ships, but could not confirm if carriers were present. Nagumo faced a decision: continue rearming for a second strike on Midway, or rearm with anti-ship weapons to attack the American fleet. At 07:45 hours, Nagumo ordered rearming to stop. The aircraft would be rearmed with torpedoes to attack the American ships. This required reversing the entire process. Remove the land attack bombs, bring up torpedoes from the magazines, install them on aircraft, another 90 minutes minimum. But Nagumo had no choice. If American carriers were nearby, they were the priority target. At 08:30 hours, the strike force that had attacked Midway began returning. Nagumo had to recover them before launching any strike against American ships. He ordered all carriers to prepare to recover aircraft. This meant clearing the flight decks completely. Any aircraft spotted on deck had to be struck below to make room for the returning strike aircraft. The rearming process was now completely disrupted. Aircraft were moved to the hangar decks. The flight decks were cleared. The returning strike aircraft landed between 08:37 and 01:18 hours. Many were damaged and low on fuel. Some crashed on landing. The decks were chaotic. By 09:18 hours, all returning aircraft were recovered. Now Nagumo could launch the strike against the American fleet. But first, the aircraft had to be respotted on the flight deck, refueled and rearmed. The process would take at least 30 minutes. During this period, both American torpedo bombers attacked the Kido Butai. Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet, Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise, and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. All attacked between 09:20 and 10:24 hours. The attacks were uncoordinated. The squadrons attacked individually, one after another. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire slaughtered them. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, 35 were shot down. None scored a torpedo hit. The attacks appeared to be a complete failure. But the torpedo attacks drew Japanese fighters down to sea level. Every Zero in the combat air patrol was engaged with torpedo bombers at wave-top height. None were at altitude. The fighter directors aboard the carriers were focused on the torpedo threat. Radar operators, lookouts, and controllers were watching the sea surface. At 10:22 hours, no one was looking up. McCluskey's dive bombers arrived at 14,000 feet completely undetected. At 10:22 hours, McCluskey identified 3 carriers and assessed the tactical situation. Akagi and Kaga were close together, turning into the wind. Soryu was several miles south. McCluskey made his decision in seconds. He would attack Kaga with Bombing Squadron 6. He ordered Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding Scouting Squadron 6, to attack Akagi. Best had only 3 aircraft remaining. The other aircraft in his squadron had followed McCluskey toward Kaga before Best could stop them. Best's 3 aircraft would attack Akagi alone. At 10:26 hours, McCluskey pushed over into his dive. 34 Dauntless bombers followed him toward Kaga. At 10:26 hours and 30 seconds, Lieutenant Richard Best pushed over toward Akagi. 2 Dauntless bombers followed him. 3 aircraft attacking the flagship of the Kido Butai. Aboard Akagi, no one saw them coming. Lookouts were watching the torpedo bombers withdrawing at sea level. Fighter directors were vectoring Zeros to intercept stragglers. Damage control parties were preparing to fight fires from near misses. Flight deck crews were spotting aircraft for launch. The strike force, fully armed and fueled, was arranged on the flight deck. 18 fighters forward, 18 dive bombers amidships, 18 torpedo bombers aft. Fuel lines snaked across the deck, connecting aircraft to refueling points. Ordnance carts loaded with bombs and torpedoes were positioned near aircraft. The deck was crowded, flammable, and explosive. At 10:26 hours and 40 seconds, a lookout aboard Akagi spotted aircraft diving from above. He shouted a warning. Captain Taijiro Aoki, commanding Akagi, looked up and saw 3 dauntless dive bombers in near vertical dives. He ordered hard left rudder. Akagi began to turn. Best's first bomb was released at 2,500 feet. The 1,000-pound semi-armor-piercing bomb fell for 3 seconds. It missed Akagi's deck by 10 feet, striking the water close alongside. The explosion caused no damage. Best's wingman released his bomb at 2,000 feet. The bomb struck Akagi's flight deck 20 feet aft of the midship's elevator. It penetrated the flight deck, passed through the upper hangar deck, and detonated in the middle hangar deck among aircraft being rearmed. The explosion ruptured fuel lines and ignited aviation gasoline. Fire spread instantly through the hangar deck. Aircraft caught fire. Ordnance began cooking off. Torpedoes armed with 450-pound warheads were stacked throughout the hangar, awaiting installation on aircraft. The fire reached them within seconds. Best's second wingman released at 1,800 feet. The bomb struck Akagi's flight deck aft near the port edge. It penetrated the deck and detonated in the lower hangar level. Another fire started immediately. Within 60 seconds of Best's attack, Akagi was burning on 3 levels. The flight deck was intact, but the fires below were spreading. Damage control parties responded immediately but were overwhelmed. The hangar decks contained hundreds of tons of aviation gasoline and ruptured fuel lines, dozens of armed aircraft, and hundreds of bombs and torpedoes. The fire grew exponentially. At 10:30 hours, 4 minutes after the bomb hit, the first torpedo warhead exploded. The explosion blew out Akagi's port-side hull plating, flooding several compartments. More explosions followed. Bombs detonated. Torpedoes exploded. Each explosion fed the fire and triggered more explosions. At 10:38 hours, Captain Aoki reported to Admiral Nagumo that Akagi could no longer be controlled from below decks. Smoke and fire had made the command spaces uninhabitable. Nagumo transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagara at 10:46 hours. He and his staff climbed down ropes from Akagi's flight deck to a cutter that took them to Nagara. Abandoning the flagship was humiliating but necessary. Nagumo could not command the battle from a burning ship. Damage control efforts continued for hours. Akagi's crew fought the fires with every resource available. They flooded magazines to prevent further explosions. They sealed compartments to contain the flames. They jettisoned ordnance overboard to reduce the explosive hazard. Nothing worked. The fires were too large, too hot, too widespread. By 16:30 hours, the fire had spread to the engine rooms. Boilers began exploding. Akagi lost all power. At 1800 hours, Captain Aoki ordered abandon ship. The crew went over the side into the water. Destroyers picked them up. At 19:15 hours, only a skeleton damage control party remained aboard. They were still trying to save the ship. At 0200 hours, on June 5th, Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from the battleship Yamato, ordered Akagi scuttled. She was still afloat but dead in the water, burning from stem to stern, and would be a liability if American forces found her. 4 destroyers fired torpedoes into Akagi's hull. She sank at 05:20 hours on June 5, 1942, in position 30°30 and 104 to approximately 50 miles northwest of Midway Island. She took with her 267 of her crew. The rest, approximately 700 men, were rescued. The wreck of Akagi was located in October 2019 by the research vessel RV Petrel during an expedition led by Vulcan Inc. The wreck lies in 18,011 feet of water over 3 miles down, resting upright on the seafloor. The flight deck has collapsed into the hangar spaces. The hull shows extensive fire and explosion damage. The stern is partially separated from the main hull. Video footage from remotely operated vehicles showed the remains of the island structure, the collapsed flight deck, and debris scattered around the main wreck. The loss of Akagi and 3 other carriers at Midway destroyed the Kido Butai and ended Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, and 3,057 men, including many of its most experienced pilots. The United States lost 1 carrier, 145 aircraft, and 307 men. The strategic balance shifted permanently. Japan would spend the rest of the war on the defensive. The technical analysis of why Akagi sank so quickly reveals fundamental design flaws inherited from her battlecruiser origins. Her hangar decks were not isolated from each other. Fire could spread vertically through open spaces and elevator shafts. Her damage control systems were inadequate for fighting major fires. She had insufficient firefighting equipment, insufficient fire suppression systems, and insufficient training for damage control parties. Most critically, Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized offensive power over defensive resilience. Akagi's hangar decks were designed to maximize aircraft capacity and speed of operations. Aircraft were fueled and armed in the hangars, not on the flight deck. This created a catastrophic vulnerability. A single bomb penetrating to the hangar deck could ignite hundreds of tons of aviation gasoline and explode hundreds of bombs and torpedoes stored among the aircraft. American carriers learned this lesson after USS Lexington was lost at Coral Sea on May 8, 1942. Aviation gasoline vapors in Lexington's hangar sparked internal explosions that destroyed the ship. After Lexington's loss, American carriers implemented procedures to minimize gasoline vapor accumulation and to arm aircraft on the flight deck rather than in the hangars. Japanese carriers never made these changes. Through 1944, they continued to fuel and arm aircraft in hangars, continued to store ordnance in hangars, continued to operate with minimal damage control capabilities. The result was that Japanese carriers remained vulnerable to catastrophic loss from single bomb hits. This vulnerability was inherent in the original battlecruiser design. Akagi was built for speed and firepower, not survivability. Her hull was lightly armored, her subdivision was minimal. Her design prioritized offensive capability over defensive resilience. These compromises made sense for a battlecruiser that would use speed to avoid damage. They made no sense for a carrier that would be the primary target in every engagement. The conversion from battlecruiser to carrier never fully addressed these fundamental weaknesses. Akagi remained at her core a battlecruiser hull adapted to carry aircraft. She was fast, she was powerful, but she was fragile. One bomb destroyed her. The lesson of Akagi's loss is that design compromises have consequences that persist across decades. The decisions made in 1920 to build her as a fast battlecruiser determined her fate in 1942. The decisions made in 1923 to convert her into a carrier while preserving her high speed and minimal armor guaranteed she would be vulnerable. The decisions made in 1935 to modernize her flight deck without fundamentally improving her damage control or protective systems ensured that vulnerability would be fatal. Akagi was a symbol of Japan's carrier revolution. She spearheaded the doctrine that carriers massed together could dominate naval warfare. She proved that doctrine at Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and Ceylon. But at Midway, the doctrine failed. The Kido Butai was caught vulnerable. Its fighters were out of position. Its decks were cluttered. Its damage control was inadequate. 3 American dive bombers destroyed the flagship in 4 minutes. The ship that had led Japan's conquest of the Pacific burned for 24 hours and sank in 18,000 feet of water. The fatal flaw was not that Akagi was poorly designed. For the tactical environment, she was designed for surface combat at high speed, with quick disengaging. Her design was excellent. The fatal flaw was that carrier warfare evolved, and Akagi's fundamental vulnerabilities were never corrected. She was built for speed and offense. She died because she could not survive a single hit.